You frightened me. I am today on the horns of a dilemma. Oh, I know. It's me, Galen. Galen's got Parkinson's. Now, the reason why I'm on the horns of a dilemma, and it's a nice dilemma, is because I've been in a historic group of wargamers. I'm going to say not the wargamers themselves aren't historic, but we are very old. So I suppose from that standpoint we are, and we play largely historical games, old school, big armies, period in history. You researched uniforms. People can do this, that, right? But since I've moved very recently, 3 weeks, 2 weeks, I'm now in a much younger group of people who are doing Dungeons and Dragons. And what I'd like to do, I'd like to have the historical games here and the role play games here and go game. But although I can see, and I'd be interested to know what you think, I can see how easy that is. There's definitely a resistance, not necessarily with the people that are playing now, but there is a resistance, and there has been, I would say, since the 80s, since Dungeons and Dragons became super popular, that historical gamers just don't. I don't do role-playing games. I don't do fantasy. I don't do science fiction. And recently, I don't do skirmish games. I heard somebody said that to me. I don't do skirmish games. That's a bit of a big dismissal, isn't it? Really. For me, it is anyway, because you're missing out on something, and you can play them into bigger games. You could have, I don't know, voltigeurs going ahead of a French group of troops towards enemy territory, into a village, and you could have perhaps some Russian infantry defending the village, and it could be a dozen aside. You haven't got the massive expense if you're new to the game. You can have larger scales because you've got less figures on the table. It's part of a war game, surely, but no, it gets dismissed. And then you've got the fantasy gamers who say, I've never done that, really. And I think they're probably the ones who've got the biggest excuse. Because if you're in your 20s, 30s, you've probably not been exposed to historical gaming in the way I was when I was in my 20s. When I was in my 20s, historical gaming was pretty much all there was. I was 21 when Dungeons and Dragons arrived in the UK, and I did play fantasy games before that, and I played science fiction games before that. Fantasy games were always based on Lord of the Rings. They were always set in Middle Earth. Science fiction games, more imaginative. They weren't set in any particular place, partly because of copyright, but they were just sort of random science fiction figures. I was lucky. I was lucky in that I went to a War Games club from 1972, where it was pure old-fashioned 60s and 70s Featherstone's type game clubs. It was War Games Research Group. It was largely Napoleonic. It was almost exclusively 25mm Hinchcliffe. That's what we all did. So I got into that mindset. Then, when I was 17, Miniature Figurines in Southampton got a license from the Tolkien estate to make fantasy figures that had to be based on Lord of the Rings, even though when you see the figures now, they weren't very accurate portrayals of those figures. Gollum looks like the Michelin Man. But they were designed so that you had the same process of Napoleonic gaming, for example. You'd have a unit of 30 elves, and they'd have commander, and you'd have 12 cavalry and they'd have a commander, and you'd shove the two together and that'd be an elf army, and a goblin army would be the same. And even had point systems. Miniature figurines continue with that, but they slowly, as Dungeons and Dragons appeared in the UK, I would say it started to be on people's minds from 78. It's hard, isn't it? Because that's my perspective. I mean, that's me in 78. I suddenly went, oh, like that. And I almost went like that, oh, but I didn't. I went, oh. And I got into Dungeons and Dragons. I loved it. I still love historical gaming. Didn't stop that. I didn't go, oh, I'm doing that now, throw that out the window. Crackers, why would you do that? I'm really enjoying that. I'm not doing it anymore. So, fantasy going along. Miniature figurines and people, Asgard, Grenadier, were making their own fantasy figures. The miniature figurines started to make sword and sorcery rather than Lord of the Rings. The Dungeons and Dragons changed when it first arrived, and if you look at the early Gary Gygax's work, a lot of the characters in it were from Lord of the Rings. They had hobbits. They had hobbits. They had elves that were from Lord of the Rings. They had dwarves, for example. Orcs was spelt like Tolkien spelt it. Over time, as the game started to be published, there were troubles with the law. The law, it's the law! Oh, I am the law. And they had to change it for legal reasons. They changed the spelling of orcs. They turned elves into something different. The hobbits became halflings. But they were all really as a result of legal battles. We're not using that. Grr, stop doing it. So they went, oh, we'll stop doing it then. Well, they didn't stop doing it. They just called it something else and went, nah, nah. And they probably went like that as well. I like doing that. You can have that one. Have that one on me. Do that to somebody today. It don't have to be malicious. Just say Galen told me to do it. What can I tell you? So I thought, what can I do? There has to be some answer to this. So I thought of an answer. I don't know if it's a very pretty answer, but it's an answer. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to have an historical game with a fantasy element. So I'm going to please everybody. Now, I know that means I'm going to end up pleasing nobody. And I know that now. I know that before you even tell me. Am I going to stop? No, I'm not. And one of the things that the historical gamers are doing a lot of at the moment are 17th century games set in the Caribbean with Spanish infantry, French infantry, pirates. And at that time, or slightly before that time, Oliver Cromwell and the English invaded the Caribbean after the English Civil War. And it was England's first toehold in the Caribbean, if you like. It was a disaster, really. It didn't work, but they did it. And so I'm going to have a European force of regular troops. So they're going to be formed musket men, they're going to be trained regulars, they are going to be B-class and C-class infantry. There might be a few D-class rabble, but I don't know. That's the historical side. They're going to be units of 8, and I'm going to use Osprey's game, Pikeman's Lament. So I'm going to have proper historical rules that historical gamers can go, yeah, I know that. But the fantasy gamers won't be used to these large blocks of units, because what I'm bringing in for them is the captains of the units are going to be role-playing characters using all the characteristics of Dungeons and Dragons as it is now. So they're going to have wisdom throws. they're going to have a constitution, they're going to have intelligence, they're going to have strength, all yeah, Dungeons and Dragons stuff. So they will be rounded characters. So I'm going to have tribal troops on one side, and I'm going to have regular European troops on the other side, and they're going to be principally the two armies. So the armies are going to be wargaming, commanders are going to be roleplay. I'm going to have a slave camp, I'm going to have it surrounded by jungle, and the idea is that the natives have to destroy the slave camp, the slavers have to survive. That's the basic historical type of game scenario you'd have with Osprey. You destroy those three buildings, and you do that by going bop, 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 tick. Done. I'm going to put some loot in. I'm going to sort of coins and gold pieces and so on. Now generally in the historical games, if you capture things like loot, it's normally a model of a treasure chest. But look what I've got. I'm going to have to move to show it properly. I've got money. Money. I've got fantasy coinage. So I'm going to use that. Bit of a fantasy game, bit of roleplay. But there's going to be a third element to this game. So the third element is going to be an old, ruined, churchy type monastery in a mangrove swamp. And anyone who goes into the mangrove swamp, and there will be incentives to go in, will trigger the emergence of these skeletal ghostly pirates. I've got 8 at the moment I'm working on. I'll say, ta-da, joke.